My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 42 years old. For most of my adult life, I believed family loyalty was stronger than any contract, stronger than money, and stronger than ambition. My father built a company from nothing, a modest logistics firm that became the backbone of our community. I grew up inside its walls, learning every detail, every system, every negotiation. I wasn't just preparing to inherit it one day. I was preparing to protect it. But the day my father passed, I discovered that loyalty is fragile, and betrayal often wears the mask of a smile. It came from the last place I ever expected, my stepmother, Eleanor. She had married my father when I was 20, and though we were never close, I never imagined she would one day become my opponent. The night after the funeral, she invited me to her study. With her calm, polished voice, she told me that I wasn't qualified to run the company. She said I didn't have the modern vision required, that I was too emotionally attached to the business. Her words were sharp, but delivered with the softness of someone who believed she was untouchable. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply nodded, smiled, and told her I understood. Inside, my chest was heavy, not from rage, but from the clarity of truth that had just revealed itself. She had been waiting for this moment, waiting for my father to be gone, so she could step in and crown herself queen of an empire she never built. Her arrogance wasn't a slip, it was her plan, and I realized then, the moment I spoke back would be the moment she would win. So I didn't give her that satisfaction. Instead, I stood up, thanked her for her honesty, and left the room without a single protest. My silence was my shield, and I saw the flicker of confusion in her eyes when I didn't fight. Because people like Eleanor thrive on conflict. They feed off your anger. By refusing to show it, I denied her that fuel. But as I walked away from that house, the house that used to feel like my family's heart, I knew that silence was not surrender. It was the beginning of something else. I got in my car and drove home that night. Not once looking back. The city lights blurred through my windshield as thoughts pressed in on me. Years of loyalty dismissed, blood replaced by contracts, and the legacy of my father's life handed over to someone who didn't care for it the way I did. Betrayal, I realized, isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives in whispers, in calm explanations, in people who smile while they dismantle everything you've given your life to. 2 days later, as I sat in my apartment, my phone lit up in the dead of night. Call after call after call, 82 missed calls by morning. Eleanor's voice filled my voicemail, shifting from arrogance to panic, and I smiled for the first time in days, because I knew the wheel of control was already turning. In the days that followed, I sat in silence, replaying every word Eleanor had spoken to me. Not qualified, too emotionally attached. Words meant to diminish, but instead they revealed more about her than about me. I thought back to the years I had worked side by side with my father. Long nights in warehouses, handling contracts, even mopping floors when the staff was short. I didn't just know the company, I was the company. Every brick of its foundation carried my fingerprints. And yet with a few carefully chosen words, she believed she had erased me. I began reflecting on loyalty, how often it blinds us. I remembered moments when Eleanor had quietly influenced my father, urging him to bring in consultants, to modernize. I remembered the board meetings where her suggestions seemed small, almost harmless. My father would smile, dismiss most of them, and carry on. I never once suspected that each small attempt was part of a greater ambition. Now looking back, the signs weren't just visible, they were glaring, but blindness, when it comes from trust, is the deepest kind of blindness. The emotional weight of betrayal doesn't come all at once. It seeps in slowly, like water through a crack in stone. At first I felt stunned, not angry, not broken, just hollow. I spent hours at night staring at the ceiling, asking myself why she didn't simply trust me to carry on what my father had built. The answer, though painful, became clear. This was never about the company. It was about power. To Eleanor, the business wasn't a legacy, it was leverage. Her ticket to respect, influence, and control. And so I stopped asking why, and began asking how. How could I respond without lowering myself to her level? How could I act without rage, without making a scene, without giving her a chance to paint me as unstable or unfit? Because I knew that's what she wanted. She wanted me to lash out, to storm into the office. To prove her right, my silence once again became my greatest weapon. I started noticing how quickly panic had replaced her confidence, the missed calls, the late-night voicemails, the urgency in her tone. She had moved against me too quickly, underestimating how much of the company's loyalty remained tied, not to her, but to me. The employees, the managers, even the suppliers, these people had built bonds with me over decades. Eleanor had taken the title, but she didn't understand the language of trust, and trust cannot be inherited, it has to be earned. As I listened to her messages, one after another, I realized something quietly powerful. She was losing control, and she didn't even understand why. I hadn't lifted a finger, hadn't spoken a word, and yet the ground beneath her was already beginning to shift. I knew then my path wasn't to confront her, it was to let her collapse under the weight of her own ambition. I knew that if I was going to move forward, I had to do it with precision, not passion. Anger is noisy. Strategy is silent. So, I began by revisiting everything I had ever learned about the company's inner workings. I pulled out old contracts, supply agreements, partnership deals, every document my father had trusted me to oversee. Eleanor may have taken the title, but she didn't understand the roots of this business. And a tree without roots, no matter how tall, always falls. One by one, I began reaching out to people, not with accusations, not with anger, but with quiet conversations. A phone call to the supplier we had worked with for 20 years. A coffee with the warehouse manager who knew my father better than anyone. I never once mentioned Eleanor. Instead, I reminded them of my father's values, of the trust we had built, and of the promises we had always kept. What I discovered confirmed what I suspected. Their loyalty had never transferred to her. They were waiting, watching, uncertain. And in that uncertainty I found my leverage. Eleanor was trying to run the company from the top down, focusing on titles and appearances. I, on the other hand, returned to the ground floor, the place where the real power lived. With every conversation, I wove a net of quiet assurance, letting people know I wasn't gone, that I was still here, still watching, still committed. They didn't need me to declare war, they just needed to feel my presence. Presence, I realized, was more powerful than confrontation. But presence alone wasn't enough. I began to watch Eleanor's moves carefully, like a chess player studying the board. She was ambitious, but she was sloppy. She brought in outside consultants, cutting deals without fully understanding the numbers. She pushed for flashy expansions, ignoring the fine print. And worst of all, she didn't see the traps she was setting for herself. Contracts she couldn't fulfill, promises she couldn't keep. I didn't need to expose her. I only needed to wait. Each night, I sat in silence with my notes spread across the table. There was no anger in me, only clarity. My father had once told me, the strongest revenge is to let people destroy themselves with their own greed. At the time, I didn't fully understand it. Now, watching Eleanor's empire wobble on foundations she didn't even know existed, I finally did. Revenge wasn't about striking first. It was about letting gravity do its work. So, I made my decision. I wouldn't confront her. I wouldn't fight for the company in court or in boardrooms. Instead, I would position myself quietly, aligning with the suppliers, the managers, and the employees, so that when she stumbled, I would be the only steady hand left standing. She thought I was gone, but in reality, I was becoming the shadow she couldn't escape. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. Eleanor had the title, but she lacked the trust that held everything together. At first, the signs were subtle: shipments arriving late, suppliers suddenly renegotiating contracts, employees dragging their feet on new directives. She thought it was incompetence, but I knew better. It was hesitation. They didn't believe in her, and without belief, authority is just a costume. I watched as she scrambled to fix problems that never should have existed in the first place. She sent out harsh emails, called emergency meetings, even hired temporary staff to replace those who quietly walked away. But no matter how hard she pushed, the company resisted her. It was like watching someone try to steer a ship with no rudder. The harder she turned the wheel, the less control she had, and I never lifted a finger. I just let the silence around her grow heavier. Behind the scenes, my phone never stopped buzzing. Longtime clients reached out, asking if I was still involved. Old colleagues called to say they didn't feel the same sense of direction anymore. Even the board members, once dazzled by Eleanor's polished speeches, began to sense the instability beneath the surface. Each time I gave the same calm reply: "I'm here if you need me." That was all. No promises, no accusations, just a steady voice in the storm. Eleanor, however, didn't understand storms. She believed in appearances, in glossy presentations and power suits. She didn't see that leadership isn't about being seen, it's about being trusted. As her panic grew, her mistakes multiplied. She signed an aggressive expansion deal that the company wasn't equipped to handle, and when deadlines slipped, suppliers pulled out. She cut costs in the wrong places, demoralizing the very employees she needed most. Every decision tightened the noose she had tied for herself. And still, I remained silent. I knew the temptation to step in, to expose her failures, would be strong, but that would only make me the villain in her story. Instead, I allowed her own reflection to betray her. She had declared that I was unqualified, that I was too attached, that I didn't belong. But every call she made, every plea she left on my voicemail, told a different story. She needed me more than she would ever admit. By the end of the quarter, the weight of her choices was undeniable. The board demanded explanations. Clients threatened to walk. Employees whispered in corridors, and in that fragile silence, where her rules no longer carried authority, mine began to rise, not in anger, not in triumph, but in calm inevitability. The very legacy she tried to take from me was slipping back into my hands, not because I fought for it, but because I waited for her to drop it. The collapse began slowly, then all at once. Eleanor still clung to her role, but it was like watching a performer deliver lines to an empty theater. The board no longer applauded her strategies, the employees no longer trusted her directives, and the clients no longer believed in her promises. I didn't have to whisper a word. The silence of those around her spoke louder than anything I could have said, and the more she tried to hold on, the faster everything slipped through her fingers. I noticed it in her voice when she called me again one evening. Once filled with confidence and superiority, it now cracked under the weight of desperation. She tried to disguise it with polite phrases, asking if I would consider advising her. But I could hear the tremor underneath. I didn't rush to answer. I let the pause stretch heavy and deliberate before I calmly told her I was busy at the moment. I could almost hear her swallow the bitterness on the other end of the line. That was the moment I knew. The balance of power had shifted completely. Behind the scenes, The company had already begun to realign itself around me. The managers who had once been wary now looked to me for guidance. Clients asked for my opinion on projects. Even suppliers, who had refused Eleanor's terms, quietly reached out to confirm they would still honor the agreements made under my father. It was as though the entire structure of the business had remembered who its true foundation was. Eleanor may have been sitting in the big chair, but she was invisible. Her frustration grew with every failed attempt to reassert herself. She tried sudden firings, desperate new hires, even expensive marketing campaigns to prove she was in control. But each move only drained the company further. She didn't understand that leadership isn't about noise, it's about gravity, and gravity in this case pulled everything back toward me. I didn't push. I didn't confront. I simply stood still while she stumbled into her own undoing. I watched as the board finally acted. They called her into a private meeting demanding explanations for the mounting losses. Reports were laid out, numbers circled in red ink, questions thrown across the table that she couldn't answer. And though I wasn't in that room, I didn't need to be. I already knew the outcome. By the time she walked out, pale and shaken, her authority had evaporated. She was no longer the leader of anything. When the call came that night, it wasn't from Eleanor. It was from the chairman of the board. His voice was steady but edged with fatigue. "Daniel," he said, "we need you back. The company needs you back." I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I simply closed my eyes, breathed deeply, and agreed. Justice, I realized, doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of a simple truth. The one who tried to erase me had erased herself instead. The day I walked back into the company felt strange. The walls were the same, the desks were the same, but the air carried a different weight. I wasn't returning as the son of the founder anymore. I was returning as the quiet storm that had outlasted betrayal. Employees lifted their heads as I passed. Some smiled in relief, others simply nodded. But all of them recognized that something had shifted. I wasn't the shadow anymore. I was the anchor. Eleanor was nowhere to be found that morning. Rumors swirled that she had taken an indefinite leave of absence. In truth, the board had quietly pushed her aside, granting her a generous severance to avoid scandal. She left in silence, just as I had months before, though for very different reasons. I thought I would feel triumph at her downfall, but instead I felt a strange calm, almost pity. She had wanted power more than respect, and in the end she had neither. As I sat in my father's old office, the same chair where he once gave me my first piece of advice about business, I felt a flood of emotions. Grief for the father I'd lost, gratitude for the trust of those who stood by me, and a quiet pride that I had reclaimed, not just the company, but my own sense of self. The victory hadn't come from fighting, but from waiting, listening, and knowing that the truth always reveals itself in time. That night I went home and sat in the dark, reflecting on the journey. Betrayal had nearly broken me, but it had also sharpened me. It taught me that silence can be louder than rage, that patience can be stronger than force, and that revenge doesn't always require confrontation. Sometimes, the greatest revenge is to become everything your betrayer said you could never be. I thought of my father often during those nights. I imagined what he would say if he saw me now sitting in the chair he once held, steering the company with the same steady hand he had taught me to use. I liked to think he would smile, not because I had won against Eleanor, but because I had done it without losing myself. For the first time in months, I felt peace. The storm had passed, the legacy was safe, and I had learned the hardest lesson of all. Strength isn't in the fight. Strength is in the silence before it. Peace, I discovered, is never permanent, not when ambition still lingers in the shadows. Weeks after Eleanor's quiet removal, whispers began to surface. She hadn't disappeared, she had retreated. And in her retreat, she was gathering allies. I heard from a trusted friend on the board that she was quietly meeting with investors, trying to paint herself as the victim of an unfair coup. It didn't surprise me. People like Eleanor don't accept defeat. They rewrite the story until they can live with it. I chose not to confront her. Instead, I focused on strengthening what mattered, rebuilding the company from within. I walked the floors, listened to employees, and restored the trust that had been fractured during her reign. My father had always said that a company is not numbers on a page, it's people, and people needed to feel safe again. Slowly, the old rhythm returned. Shipments moved on time, clients renewed contracts, and the tired heaviness in the office began to lift. But even as stability returned, I could feel Eleanor's presence like a storm cloud beyond the horizon. She was clever, I'll give her that. Instead of attacking me directly, she went after perception. Small articles appeared in business journals, anonymous quotes, questioning whether I was truly prepared to lead in a modern market. Investors received subtle emails, hinting that Eleanor was exploring opportunities with others. It wasn't loud enough to spark scandal, but it was constant enough to plant doubt. And doubt, if left alone, grows like a weed. I had a choice: react and feed her narrative, or remain still and let her expose herself once more. I chose stillness. But this time, I also chose preparation. I began documenting everything, every reckless contract she had signed, every promise she had broken, every number that exposed the damage she left behind. I wasn't gathering this for revenge. I was gathering it as insurance, a quiet shield for the day her shadow tried to darken the company again. In private, I also strengthened alliances. I met with clients face to face, not to talk about contracts, but to talk about trust. I reminded them that we had survived storms before and would do so again. I showed them not just numbers, but a vision rooted in the same principles my father built. When people see that you don't flinch under pressure, they believe in you more deeply, and I wanted them to believe not just in the company, but in me. Still, there was a heaviness in knowing Eleanor wasn't done. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was plotting. And as much as I wanted to move forward, I couldn't ignore the truth. The battle wasn't over. It was only shifting into a new form, one that required me to be sharper, quieter, and stronger than ever before. The counterstrike came on a Monday morning, as most disasters do, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. A letter landed on the board's desk, drafted by Eleanor's lawyers. In it, she claimed that my father had promised her a controlling interest in the company before his death. She painted herself as the rightful heir, the overlooked widow who had been robbed by a son hungry for power. The boardroom was tense when they told me. I could see the unease in their eyes, not because they believed her, but because they feared the noise she could create. When I read her claims, I didn't feel rage. I felt the kind of cold focus that only betrayal can sharpen. Every line of her letter was designed to provoke, to drag me into a courtroom where perception mattered more than truth. She wanted me to fight openly, to make this a spectacle, but I refused. Instead, I quietly handed the board copies of the very documents I had been collecting for weeks. Contracts Eleanor had signed without authority, financial mistakes that cost the company millions, and correspondences proving her reckless disregard for the business. The board studied the papers in silence, their earlier unease melting into something else. Realization. Eleanor's claims were nothing but smoke. If she wanted a battle, she had chosen the wrong field. While she built castles out of words, I had built fortresses out of facts, and facts, once revealed, cannot be undone. The chairman leaned back, exhaled deeply, and said only one sentence. She's destroyed her own credibility. But Eleanor wasn't done. Days later, she went to the press. Articles appeared with her name this time, bold headlines about a widow fighting for her rightful place. For the first time, my name was dragged into public mud. Friends called, asking if the rumors were true. Employees whispered nervously in hallways. And yet even then, I didn't respond. I didn't give interviews. I didn't release statements. I didn't play her game. Because I knew something she didn't. The louder she shouted, the more hollow her words would sound. Behind closed doors, I made my real move. I met with our top investors and clients personally, not to defend myself, but to show them stability. I laid out detailed plans for the company's future, measured, realistic, and grounded in everything we had already begun to rebuild. While Eleanor shouted in newspapers, I quietly built confidence in boardrooms, and slowly, one by one, the people who mattered turned their backs on her narrative. What Eleanor never understood was this: you can win the public for a day, but you can only keep power through trust. And trust was something she had burned to ashes. Every article, every claim, every desperate speech only revealed her fear of being forgotten. Meanwhile, I didn't need to prove anything. My silence once again was louder than her noise. The first cracks in Eleanor's campaign appeared not in boardrooms, but in the press she depended on. Journalists, hungry for drama, had initially paraded her story across their pages, but drama is a fire that consumes quickly, and soon they began to dig deeper. When they looked past her words, they found the trail I had already uncovered: failed contracts, unpaid debts, and reckless decisions that cost the company dearly during her short reign. What she intended as her stage became her interrogation. Reporters no longer wrote of a widow robbed, but of a woman whose ambition outpaced her ability. I didn't need to lift a finger to fuel the flames. Each day, another article appeared, questioning her credibility. One paper exposed how she had nearly bankrupted a key partnership. Another revealed she had taken personal trips, billed as company expenses. The more she tried to defend herself, the more tangled her words became. She lashed out, giving long, emotional interviews. But emotion doesn't erase facts, and slowly the public began to turn. Inside the company, the shift was even clearer. Employees who had once feared her shadow now laughed quietly at the absurd headlines. Clients sent me messages of support, expressing relief that the truth was finally surfacing. Even the board, who had once wavered at her noise, now stood firmly behind me. Eleanor had not only burned bridges, she had salted the earth around them. She was alone, and worse, everyone knew it. Still, I didn't gloat. I remained steady. I walked through the offices each morning with the same calm smile, greeted every employee by name, and spoke with quiet conviction about the future. My silence wasn't just a shield anymore. It had become a source of strength for those around me. They saw that I didn't need to fight Eleanor, because her collapse was inevitable, and that calmness gave them confidence. But even as she unraveled publicly, Eleanor's desperation grew. I heard whispers that she had begun approaching our competitors, offering them insider information in exchange for a seat at their table. Some listened, tempted by the drama, but most dismissed her. She wasn't a strategist. She was a liability, a storm no one wanted in their house. I didn't interfere, didn't warn anyone. I simply let her dig. And dig she did. With every attempt to claw her way back, she sank deeper into irrelevance. She had gone from the stepmother who tried to seize an empire to a cautionary tale splashed across headlines. Betrayal, I realized, always carries its own punishment. All you have to do is wait long enough to watch it happen. Just when I thought the storm had passed, Eleanor made her final move, subtle, dangerous, and reckless. She had somehow acquired a minority stake in the company through a silent partner, someone willing to bet on chaos. It wasn't enough to control anything, but it was enough to create uncertainty. The moment I learned, I didn't panic. I didn't confront. I simply began observing, mapping her influence and noting the weak points in the network she thought she had built. She believed that fear and rumor could be weaponized to shake confidence in my leadership. Emails were leaked, carefully crafted memos circulated, and quiet questions were raised during board meetings. It was designed to look innocent, professional, even logical, but I had seen this pattern before. Each coincidence was a trace of desperation. I didn't respond publicly. I let the whispers linger, just long enough for the truth to start settling like sediment in water. At the same time, I strengthened the foundations of the company quietly, but decisively. I met with our major stakeholders personally, reviewing contracts, clarifying procedures, and reassuring them that nothing Eleanor could do would compromise the business. Each conversation was calm, deliberate, and factual. It didn't need drama. It didn't need emotion. It only needed clarity, and that clarity made her attempts at disruption ineffective before they could even gain traction. The real victory, I realized, wasn't in stopping her. It was in letting her fail on her own. Her partner quickly realized Eleanor's stake brought more risk than value. Clients who had entertained her rumors began to see her as unpredictable and unreliable. Employees, once unsettled by her sudden appearances in meetings, started to openly question her judgment. She had built a last-ditch scheme on fear and manipulation, and the company's stability, built on decades of trust, simply wouldn't bend. I never reached out to Eleanor directly. There were no threats, no emails, no confrontation. She had underestimated the power of quiet competence, the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout to be heard. As her influence faded, I noticed a subtle shift in my own perception of power. Real control doesn't come from fear, from anger, or from titles. It comes from consistency, reliability, and patience. Everything she had lacked. By the end of that quarter, her final attempt had collapsed. The minority stake was quietly sold back to the company. Her ally severed ties, and Eleanor disappeared again, this time for good. And once again, I felt that same calm, measured satisfaction. It wasn't about revenge. It was about integrity, patience, and letting the universe align justice quietly, without spectacle. With Eleanor finally gone for good, I turned my attention to rebuilding not just the company, but my own life. Leadership is rarely about the boardroom alone. It's about the world you create around you, the culture you nurture, and the legacy you leave behind. I spent mornings walking the office floors, listening carefully to concerns, learning the subtle dynamics that had shifted during Eleanor's shadowy influence. The company was stable now, but stability is only the first step toward true growth. I also returned to the personal projects I had set aside during years of quiet dedication to my father's vision, mentoring young employees, creating community outreach programs, and establishing scholarships in my father's name became more than obligations. They were reminders of why I fought so quietly, so patiently. Every time I witnessed someone flourish under these programs, I felt the echo of my father's wisdom, the kind that said legacy is measured not by wealth, but by impact. The company itself began to thrive in ways Eleanor could never have imagined. Strategic expansions, careful innovation, and renewed trust with our partners strengthened its foundation. But more importantly, morale soared. Employees no longer worked under fear or uncertainty. They worked under a sense of purpose and alignment. I had learned that leadership is not dominance. It is consistency, patience, and integrity, and those qualities now defined every decision I made. Even in moments of quiet reflection, I could feel the weight of what had passed. Betrayal had tested me in ways I never expected. It had demanded silence, patience, and emotional strength. But it had also clarified a truth I had always sensed. Control is not about winning arguments or proving superiority. It is about mastering yourself, waiting, and knowing when to act. Eleanor had tried to steal a legacy, but in failing, she had taught me more about power than any textbook or boardroom ever could. I began journaling my experiences, not for fame or recognition, but as a map for anyone who might one day face similar trials. How to recognize quiet betrayal, how to respond without anger, and how to build strength from patience. Writing became a kind of therapy, a way to process the past while planning for the future. And in those moments, I realized that personal redemption doesn't always come with applause. It comes quietly, like the first light of morning breaking through a long night. Finally, I began to reclaim spaces in my life I had neglected. Friends, long overlooked, returned to dinners and conversations. Hobbies, once pushed aside by duty, were resumed with careful attention. Even simple acts, a walk in the park, a long phone call with an old mentor, felt revolutionary, because for the first time in years, I wasn't running from betrayal or guarding against it. I was living free from it, and that freedom, more than victory, more than control, felt like the truest reward of all. With the company secure, and my personal life slowly returning to balance, I realized that true influence doesn't end at one office door. My next focus became the wider community, not for recognition, but for impact. I reached out to local entrepreneurs offering guidance, sharing the quiet strategies I had learned from betrayal and patience. I wasn't interested in building loyalty to my name. I wanted to cultivate a network of people who understood that integrity and calm strategy outweigh flash and ambition every time. I also invested in initiatives my father had once dreamed of, but never had the resources to implement. Community training programs, sustainable projects, and partnerships with young innovators became my new mission. Each effort was calculated, deliberate, and deeply personal. I wanted to create ripples of progress that weren't dependent on me alone, but could grow independently, leaving a legacy that even betrayal couldn't erase. Meanwhile, the company's reputation soared. Word spread that stability had returned, and that the leadership was thoughtful, fair, and rooted in experience. Investors, once wary of any disruption, renewed their trust. Clients not only stayed, but brought in new partnerships, inspired by the consistent vision and the calm authority that now defined the company. Eleanor's attempts at disruption had left scars, but those scars became lessons. Proof that steady guidance is more resilient than any sudden coup. Even personally, I found that my confidence had transformed. I no longer measured my worth by the approval of others, nor did I need validation to feel strong. Quiet competence had taught me that control comes not from showing power, but from understanding it, from knowing when to act and when to observe. And as I began mentoring others, I realized that the most enduring leadership isn't loud, it's contagious. People begin to emulate patience, clarity, and integrity without ever being told to. Interestingly, Eleanor remained on the periphery of my life, a ghost of what could have been. But she had been permanently disarmed, not through confrontation, but through the quiet demonstration of her own inadequacies. Her presence was now an example, not a threat, and it reminded me that not all battles need swords. Some are won by standing firm, watching, and letting the truth unfold at its own pace. As months turned into a year, I began to feel a sense of permanence that had eluded me for decades. The company was thriving, my relationships were healthy, and my influence extended far beyond the walls my father had built. And in that permanence I discovered a profound truth. True victory isn't the defeat of another, but the mastery of yourself, the cultivation of trust, and the creation of a life that even betrayal cannot disturb. I spent long nights thinking about the journey, tracing every choice, every silent maneuver that had brought me here. Betrayal, I realized, is never truly about the other person. It's about the cracks they expose in your own perception, the moments where trust is given too freely or caution is neglected. Eleanor had tried to test me, to push me into anger, to force me into rash decisions, and yet it was through restraint and observation that I found my real strength. I began to understand that patience isn't passive, it's active. It's a constant vigilance, a quiet preparation that waits for the precise moment to act, rather than being driven by emotion. I thought about the countless hours I had spent listening, documenting, and simply observing. Those hours had seemed tedious at the time, but in hindsight, they were my greatest advantage. By the time Eleanor made her moves, I was already 3 steps ahead, not because I was smarter, but because I had mastered the art of calm. The most profound lesson was this: power is invisible when wielded correctly. It's not loud proclamations, dramatic confrontations, or aggressive gestures. It's subtle, quiet, and strategic. True influence grows in the background, nurtured by trust, consistency, and clarity. Eleanor had all the titles, but she lacked the foundation, and in the end, the difference between survival and collapse wasn't skill, it was preparation and composure. I also reflected on forgiveness, not for Eleanor, but for myself. There was a period where I felt bitterness, a shadow that whispered I had been wronged, that the world had been unfair. But holding on to that shadow only made the days heavier. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't about the betrayer. It's about freeing yourself to act with full focus, to rebuild without weight, and to live without the constant pull of resentment. That freedom is more powerful than any victory. Another insight struck me: leadership is never about proving yourself to others. It's about demonstrating competence and integrity in ways that others cannot ignore. I had reclaimed the company, not through confrontation, not through drama, but by embodying the qualities Eleanor lacked: calm, quiet, strategic action. Those were the tools that had dismantled her schemes without me ever raising my voice. And those same tools now shaped the life I wanted to live beyond the office. Finally, I recognized that life is cyclical, challenges will always arise, and betrayal will inevitably visit us in some form. But the lessons I had learned, patience, observation, trust, preparation, these were now mine to carry forward. Eleanor's shadow, once looming, had faded entirely, and as I looked ahead, I felt a profound sense of peace, the kind that only comes when you have truly mastered yourself, navigated treachery without compromise, and emerged stronger, wiser, and free. The world outside the company shifted, but inside, I had found a rhythm that no betrayal could disrupt. Mornings began with clarity, evenings ended with reflection. I wasn't just the man who had survived Eleanor's schemes. I was someone who had transformed survival into mastery. Every decision I made now carried the weight of experience, tempered with wisdom, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I no longer needed to prove myself to anyone. I invested in long-term visions, not for recognition, but for permanence. Foundations that supported young entrepreneurs, scholarships that empowered innovation, and partnerships that encouraged ethical leadership became my new boardroom. In every success, I saw the echoes of my father's principles: trust, patience, integrity, applied not just to business, but to life itself. These weren't just achievements, they were proof that one could emerge from betrayal not hardened, but elevated. Even Eleanor's memory became a lesson rather than a wound. I saw now that her presence had been necessary, a test of my patience, of my strategic mind, of my ability to remain unshaken. The quiet revenge had been satisfying, yes, but the real triumph was internal. She had forced me to confront the shadows within myself, To prove that control over one's own mind and actions is more powerful than control over any company or title. Friends, family and colleagues noticed the change. I no longer carried tension, nor the subtle vigilance that had once defined every interaction. My presence became calm, reassuring, and inspirational, a living example that resilience is quiet, not loud, and that victory is measured in peace, not applause. People sought guidance, not because I had dominated, but because I had endured and emerged wiser. In the evenings, when the office was empty, I sometimes walked the halls alone. I paused in my father's old office, gazing at the chair where he once sat. I no longer felt the pressure of expectation or the sting of betrayal. Instead, I felt completion, a life rebuilt with intentionality, a company restored with integrity, and a mind unburdened by resentment. That freedom was the ultimate reward. And finally, I realized that my story, the betrayal, the silence, the patient strategy, and the quiet victory, had created something enduring. Not a tale of revenge, but a testament to self-mastery. I had achieved something far greater than any title or fortune: peace, respect, and control over my own destiny. In that stillness, I was truly free.